get going. So here is our agenda today. These are the things that we will be going over. I'm going to start off with the ag water definition, at least for the produce safety rule, harvest and post-harvest water and testing, what those requirements would look like and what the rule says, any record requirements for any of that, inspections, what that looks like as far as anything that entails. And then pre-harvest water, we will be touching base on that just a little bit. Just kind of going over what the rule says, what the requirements are. Of course, we'll end on resources and then also questions. Feel free at any time to stop us or feel free to put your questions in the chat. I will get to them at the end. So let's move on. So again, like I said, we will be starting with harvest and post-harvest first, and then we'll be moving into pre-harvest ag water requirements. First, starting off with what is considered agricultural water. So at least under the produce safety rule, what is considered ag water is anything that comes in contact with the harvestable portion of the crop. When does that start? It starts at the flowering cycle. So anything after that point is considered the harvestable portion, and any water that comes into contact with that would then be considered ag water. Now, as far as harvest and post-harvest goes, it does have to have no detectable generic E. coli within a 100 milliliter sample. You will be so sick of hearing me say that because I say it multiple times because this is the most important part. It does have to have no detectable generic E. coli. And then also something super specific for harvest and post-harvest water is that no untreated surface water can be used. So maybe asking yourself, well, what is considered harvest and post-harvest water? I may or may not have that on my operation. So these are just some examples of what the rule says is considered harvest and post-harvest water, right? So any kind of dehydration prevention, if you use it for transporting, such as in like a flume system of some kind, cooling, washing of produce. I know a lot of farms, they'll wash their leafy greens sometimes or wash, maybe do a pre-wash of maybe some of their root vegetables such as carrots or radishes or anything along those lines. Ice and ice slurries are also considered as well. I know ice isn't used very often here because we know that water is a precious commodity, but again, it is something to consider if you are using ice, that it does have to meet these requirements. Of course, also hand washing, that's also a very important one too. You don't want to be using water that your employees are using to wash their hands, and especially if they are touching the produce, then if there's any bacteria on their hands, it's now getting on your produce, getting on your harvest bins, it's getting everywhere. And then, of course, also food contact surfaces. So any of your harvest bins, so if you're cleaning them right, which you should be doing, so any of your equipment, if you use any of that. So anything along these lines, this is what's harvest and post-harvest water. If you use water to do any of these, it has to meet those requirements. As far as testing, this is something specific for harvest and post-harvest water. There is a testing requirement because, again, it has to meet that no detectable generic E. coli. And with that comes certain things that you have to do. So one is if your water, if you test it and there's no detectable generic E. coli, you only have to test once a year. When that is kind of up to you. We encourage you to do it closer to the growing season so that way you know what the water source is, but not necessarily. Then, however, if you do find that there's any generic E. coli, you would have to immediately stop using it, but then also test it 4 times a year until you hit that no detectable generic E. coli. And then what it also does is then it also triggers these other things. You would have to do water treatment monitoring, and that is a record that you would have to keep. What corrective actions you did to make sure that there was no detectable generic E. coli. What that looks like, it varies from farm to farm. It's up to you what that looks like. And then if you are treating any surface water, any scientific data to show the method that you used. This is kind of something that's coming up. But you would have to have records for all of these if your water does not meet the no detectable generic E. coli. As far as records, especially for an inspection, these are the ones that we will be looking for. One of them is the water system inspection. So this one also needs to be done on an annual basis. You need to be making sure that your water system is not going to be contaminating your water. So this kind of looks like, are you checking your pipes? Are you making sure if if there's rubber gaskets that they're in good condition? Also, if you have any wells, making sure that, there's no contamination points. If you have a concrete pad, that there aren't any cracks where water can leak in, that it's graded away from your well instead of toward it, because again, if there's any water that gets in there, it could potentially contaminate your water source. So that is something that an inspector would be looking for. Also, those testing records. So it could be specifically if you have a well, right? You can go to your city or county. Most of them have a water testing lab. If you need a list of ones, we would be happy to give those to you that meet this, that do the no detectable generic E. coli testing. And then what you do is you contact the lab. They send you the sample cups and give you directions on how they want you to take the sample. Most of them give you some kind of shipping so you can ship it back, or if they're close enough, you can drive it to the lab. Something to kind of keep in mind though is some labs don't do testing on Fridays, so kind of keep that in the back of your head of if you're wanting to get testing done and it's on a Thursday, that it might not work. You might have to wait till the following week to send it in. As far as municipal water, if you have a municipal water source, you would have to reach out to your city and county. They're the ones that have those tests to show that the water meets the standard. With municipal, they have to meet the drinking water standard, which is what we're looking for. So that is something that you would have to get from them in order to show that your water is in compliance. And then, of course, if applicable, if you run into a situation where you don't have where you have detectable E. coli, then you would have to show water treatment monitoring, corrective actions, and then if you're treating surface water, that scientific method. And then something with the produce safety rule that's specific for us is it's 2 years of records. So this is what an inspector would be looking for, is 2 years worth of these. So kind of keep that. Also is that this doesn't also apply to ag water. It applies to all records excluding your sales ones. Those have to be 3, but everything else is on a 2-year basis. As far as inspection reporting, so what happens during an inspection is an inspector comes out, they walk through your operation, and then they should be discussing with you, like, here are the observations I'm seeing. These are the things that, are non-compliant. These are the observations I found. And then whatever corrective actions that you two decide on, that's what's written. So then what they do is they take that, they compile it into what's called an inspection summary report. So this is something that they fill in. It's going to have everything that you guys talked about on there, any observations that they found. That is then sent to Dwayne. Dwayne looks it over, makes sure it's all good. Then you'll get an email from Dwayne with this inspection summary report, and then also an email kind of outlining the different things that were found. So this is what you would be getting if you are, again, getting an inspection. It would highlight those observations, not only for ag water, but anything found on your farm. But since we're ag water focused right now, that's what we're talking about. And then as far as corrective actions, that's going to be between you and your inspector. We kind of, allow them that autonomy of creating that kind of deadline, because they'd be the one, if they would have to come out to re-inspect you, that they would be the ones setting that up. Most follow-ups, though, typically what we have seen is just a photo and that's good. So it kind of just, again, kind of depends on the situation, depends on what it is. So kind of keep that in mind when you are going through an inspection, at least for your harvest and post-harvest water. Now, this year with very small farms, you guys did lose your enforcement discretion. in January. So we are doing that educate while we regulate approach just because this is the first time that you will be needing to be in compliance with the harvest and post-harvest rules. So it's going to be more of a conversation than it would be any observations written down, unless it was something what we would call egregious or an imminent threat, where we would see a direct contact and to the produce and where that produce could make someone sick. So that's where we'd kind of be stepping in, but this is kind of like the general high level layout of what you would expect the inspection reporting to look like. So that is all for harvest and post-harvest water. We are now going to jump into pre-harvest ag water, what the requirements are, what the rule says, and all of that. So with that, with the harvest and post-harvest, they also had the rolling in of the enforcement discretion. This is no different with the pre-harvest. They do have enforcement discretion and they do it by size. So large farms, as you can see, April 7th of this year lose their enforcement discretion. April 6th of next year is small, and then April 5th of the following year is very small. To kind of give you an idea of if you don't know what size farm you are and when your enforcement discretion would end, a large farm is considered for your 3-year rolling average of produce sales to be about 638,000 to about 250. That's, or sorry, 638 and above is a large farm. A small farm is about 250,000 to that 638,000 level. And then a very small farm is 31,000 to about 250. Just to kind of give you an idea of, if you kind of have an idea of where your sales kind of fall into, that's what this is going to look like. Now, something that we want to emphasize here, because we do see literally in about a week that large farms lose their enforcement discretion on this. We are taking our own discretion on how we are enforcing it this year. We want to continue that educate while we regulate approach, especially with pre-harvest ag water. We're wanting to make sure that the water isn't becoming an adulteration source to the produce. However, our inspectors haven't gone through any kind of FDA training. They were supposed to go through one. We were supposed to go through one in February, but it was canceled. The information that we have gotten from the FDA as far as any guidance documents and training has been pushed. We have been told that we may be looking at a date of October of this year of getting anything like that. So we thought that it wasn't fair to enforce something that we haven't even gotten training on. So this is something that we felt very strongly that, so this year, if you're a large farm and getting inspected, what that's going to look like as far as pre-harvest ag water goes is it's just going to be a conversation. It's going to be a conversation of what the requirements are, of making sure you understand what is needed going forward. But unless there's something egregious that an inspector is seeing with your pre-harvest ag water, it's just going to be a conversation, just because we have not been given the proper training in order to then give you guys the information that you need. So just an FYI, that's that. Yes, you do lose your enforcement discretion, but we aren't seeing it that way. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out if you are getting inspected this year and want to know exactly what we would be looking for. So when was this finalized? So this was actually finalized last May. Published the final rule on it. So these next 3 bullets, I call it like the legalese. This is what the rule says. So what the pre-harvest ag water rule was before, it was very prescriptive. If you used surface water, you had to test about 20 times, and it had to meet like a statistical, like the geometric mean and the statistic threshold and all of that. And you had to have like a PhD in statistics in order to understand it. And so there was a lot of pushback on that. And especially with the 20 tests, I mean, for one test, you're looking at, depending on what lab you go to, you can be looking at $20 to even $50, $60, if not $100 per test, just depending on what you're needing to get done. So if you think about it, 20 tests, if at 25 bucks a pop, like that can get quite expensive, even for a small farm with their produce sales being about 30,000. So there was a lot of pushback on that. So then what they decided to do is a system-based approach of your pre-harvest ag water and identify the hazards and manage your risks, right? So what are you so instead of going, you need to be testing your water, what it does is then it turns into, well, you know your farm, you know your water sources. You can make that judgment of what would work for you. So that's kind of what it's getting at. So it wants you to do a pre-harvest ag water assessment. It wants you to assess factors that are reasonably likely to introduce hazards into your produce or food contact surfaces. And we're going to go over those. And the next part here is that this assessment does have to be written and it needs to be done on an annual basis. And then a supervisor needs to sign it and then they need to date it as well. Who that supervisor is, it could be your food safety manager, it could be the owner, but it should be the person who's filling out the assessment, should be signing off on it. As far as, like I said, I had touched on that there are certain factors that you would have to consider with your pre-harvest ag water. Here are some of them. These are the ones that they have outlined. One of them being ag water system. So what's your water source? Is it well? Is it surface? Is it municipal? How are you distributing that water? Is it an open system? Is it open to the elements? Because again, that's going to have a different risk versus a closed system. Are you using pipes to siphon off from a surface water reservoir into drip, that kind of thing? So kind of keeping that in mind of what kind of factors or what kind of risks there are with that. And then your ag water practices, depending how do you apply that water? So do you use drip? Do you furrow? Do you flood? Do you use overhead irrigation? Each of those have different risks depending on what you are doing. And kind of keep in mind, right, with the ag water definition, anything that comes into the contact with the harvestable portion of the crop would be considered ag water. So kind of keep that in mind as far as if you're wanting to change what your application method is of would it increase your risk or not. Of course, time interval and application and harvest. We know that there are farms, what they do is they stop watering, 3 days before harvest, just because there is, that die-off rate that's there. There are die-off calculators, but something else to kind of consider is that they're not as accurate as you may think. They don't take into certain considerations certain things, one of them being the crop that you're growing. It's just kind of like a high level, like what you may see, but depending on crop characteristics, right? So, with leafy greens, yes, with UV exposure and all of that, it could kill off some of the bacteria, but it doesn't kill off the bacteria that doesn't come, into contact with the sun for that UV to work versus something that sits on the ground like a cantaloupe or anything along those lines. So keeping in mind what you're growing as far as crop characteristics and infiltration, right? Can that water get into a stem scar? Can it get into a cut on your produce that could cause a situation? So those are things to kind of think about. Can my produce actually internalize any kind of hazard in my water? Is something to consider. Of course, also environmental conditions, flooding or bad weather. I know we get flooding every once in a while, but something else to kind of consider is, especially with the prevalence of it, is wildfires, just because it does burn through everything and it could cause flooding in your area if that's something that you see around you. So kind of keeping in the back of your head, do I have any weather events that typically happen that might cause an issue with the water that I use on my produce? And then, of course, the good old catch-all, right? The other relevant factors that could be testing. You can test if you would like. It is not a requirement as far as pre-harvest ag water goes. So if you do want to use testing, if that's something that you are already doing, that's great. However, that does not mean that you do not fill out an ag water assessment, because again, you would have to, what are the hazards in your water? How do you manage your risk? If you are testing your water, what are you testing for? What threshold are you going to have? And then how are you, if it's above that threshold that you create, how are you going to mitigate if it's above that? So kind of keep that in mind, is that testing does not mean that you do not have to do the assessment. It just means that it's just another thing to consider. Now, with every rule, there's always exemptions, right? So with the ag water, at least with the pre-harvest one, these are the ones that are exemptions. So if the water meets requirements that apply for harvest and post-harvest, so if I haven't said it enough, it's the no detectable generic E. coli, that it's adequate and sanitary quality for its intended use. You're not using untreated surface water, any of that. So if it does meet those requirements, you are more than welcome to use it, because you would have the testing to show that it meets those requirements. If you are using municipal water, I know some people do use municipal water for their pre-harvest. All you would have to do is show those records showing that it meets the EPA's drinking water standard, which would be a part of that paperwork that they send you. That would also work. Of course, also treated in accordance with standard outlined in the produce safety rule, but then also that it's not being changed prior to the water being used. So the example here, municipal water being put into a pond. So it's not, if you're using municipal water, that it's coming straight from the pipes, coming from the city or county that you're using, and then going right into your irrigation system. It's not being, hauled in, put into a reservoir, and then being sucked in, because you're moving something that was in a closed system into now an open one where it's maybe, open to the elements, deer can get in there or animals can get in there or anything along those lines, is something else to consider if that's something that you are doing. So this might be small and hard to read, so I'm going to walk through it. So at the top here, this is something that the FDA created. It's the assessment and risk-based outcomes of the factors that we had just talked about. So that's what it says here in this big blue box, is based in part on inspections and maintenance of agricultural water systems and evaluation of various factors. So the ones that we talked about, right? So nature of your water source, application method, degree of protection, water use, crop characteristics, environmental factors, anything else that you are considering, including testing. Then you would walk through this flow chart as far as what you could do as far as your risks. So if in this red box it says, is my water not safe or not of adequate sanitary quality? If that's a yes, if it is, then it says immediately discontinue use and implement corrective actions before you resume using it. So if it's egregious or an imminent threat, this is where it would be, you'd have to discontinue using it, and you couldn't continue using it until you make sure that it meets that. So if that's a no, it's good to go for that one. If there's any adjacent or nearby land use reasonably likely to introduce known or reasonably foreseeable hazards, specifically the hazards dealing with animals. So animal activity, biological soil amendments of animal origin, or you may have heard of BASAO, or human waste. So if it's dealing with animals and how they're going through they may be going through your water, through your field, anything along those lines. If that's a yes, then you have to implement mitigation measures promptly, no later than the same growing season that you're in. So if it's dealing with animals, then this is what you'd have to do. If not, any other conditions that could be hazards to your water, you have a couple options here for the yes. So you can either implement mitigation measures as soon as practicable, but no later than the following year. You can use water testing as part of your assessment. Again, it's not required, but it can help to determine what you do for your mitigation measure. If that's also a no, then this green box is just continue regular inspections and maintenance of your ag water system, right? Because that should be done on an annual basis, just along with your pre-harvest ag water assessment. So this is something that you would be doing on a regular basis. So something that we wanted to let you all know on October 2nd, BioSafe did amend Sanidate to be used for controlling foodborne bacterial pathogens in pre-harvest ag water with the EPA and CDA. So you can use Sanidate in your irrigation systems for your pre-harvest ag water in order to treat it. So that's the first one. So Sanidate 12.0. That second one, that's just the organic one. For those that are organic and wanted a solution, that's one. I will also be sending this link in a follow-up email. This is just a link to the labels for these Sanidates. So if you wanted to see, the full EPA label, you can read it there to get a better understanding of how you can use Sanidate for your pre-harvest ag water. But this was very exciting because up until then, there really wasn't a solution as far as treating surface water. So we had talked about the pre-harvest ag water assessment, that this was a requirement. What tools are out there that you can use to do that? So the FDA actually created an ag water assessment builder. I will again be in the follow-up email that I send. I will be also sending this link. The FDA created it for farmers to be able to use, so you'd be able to walk through it, all the different factors, to be able to see what kind of hazards you have, to manage your risk, all of that. They do not collect any of the information that you put in there. So something I do want to make sure that you're aware is that if you fill it out and don't save it, it doesn't keep the information. So if you want to save a copy of the ag water assessment that you filled out online, you would have to save it down to your desktop. Otherwise, it doesn't keep anything. So just kind of wanted to give you an FYI on that. I've had some growers go, I thought I filled it out, but I can't find it. And it's like, if you don't save it at the end, it doesn't save anything that you put in there. So if you wanted to save the assessment that you built out, that's what you would have to do. And then as far as the written evaluation of your water, it kind of walks you through these, right? What's your adjacent land use? What's your topography look like? How does the wind come through? Do you have cattle nearby that would, have some blow over into your water source? Those kind of things. What kind of runoff do you have? Do you have pooling in your fields that might cause an issue? So just things to kind of keep in mind. Now, something that I do want to emphasize that I haven't up to this point is you do have to do an ag water assessment on each pre-harvest ag water source you have. So if you are a large farm and you have multiple areas and they use multiple wells or multiple different surface water sources, you would have to do an assessment on each one of those because you're supposed to be like mitigating the hazards for that water specifically. So keep that in mind as well, if you use both surface and well, that you would have to do two different ones, or if you use two different irrigation ditches, or different water companies or anything along those lines, that you would have to do an assessment for both or all. So this is what it looks like. Just kind of wanted to give you what the first page looks like of the Ag Water Assessment Builder. This is what you see. You press continue and it walks through, like, do you have a well water source, surface water? What factors do you have? Those kind of things. So keep that in mind. But just kind of wanted to give you a screenshot of what the first page will look like. Again, I'll be providing you that link so that way you can go and fill it out for yourself. As far as resources, these are the ones that we have. We do have our 2024 annual report out. This is where you can find record templates. We do have some ag water resources in there. Specifically, we do have a couple of papers out from Arizona. Dr. Chana Rock down there, she's kind of our ag water expert. So she has been the one that's been doing a lot of the research. So if you did not pick up a paper copy, I'd be happy to mail one to you. Just let me know. Um, and it does have those record templates for that ag water system, right? For that record, but then also any other records that are required under the produce safety rule. So that is super handy to have. Something that we are working on is we know with this part of the rule, not only with harvest and post harvest, but then also pre harvest, since it hasn't been enforceable for quite a while, that farms are going to have a lot of questions on it, what regulation looks like. So we thought that we would put on some ag water field days. We had one in the Rocky Ford area in about October, but we have one planned on April 30th over on the western slope. At the CSU Western Campus, April 30th, it'll be from 10 to 2. Lunch will be provided. It is free. All you have to do is register. I'll be again providing that link if that is something you're interested in. I am finalizing dates for a Northern Colorado one. So if you are interested in that one, please let me know. I'd be happy to send you that registration link once that one has been confirmed. And then, of course, our website, we have the previous webinars that we've done. Any other resources for ag water is on there as well. So that is for you if you need it. And then, of course, that is all I have. Wanted to make sure to leave plenty of time for questions, especially since this part of the rule is fairly new. But does anyone have any questions?
But before we take questions, Sarah, I wanted to thank you first for putting the presentation together and sharing the information that we have. I want to reiterate something that Sarah said is that while the FDA hasn't come out with their guidance documents, hasn't provided any training for their inspectors or guidance for our inspectors, they also haven't provided any materials to help you through other than what Sarah showed you today in their assessment builder and some of those things. So based on all of that, that's why we made a decision that we will continue to use enforcement discretion as a Path C state, which means we're under our own state authority. We're provided funding by the FDA, but we have our own state authority. If we were a Path B state, the FDA would dictate that we would be doing inspections and what would include. But because we're a Path C state, we have some latitude to figure out how we want to enforce this. And at this time, we've chosen to use enforcement discretion to help educate our farmers as best we can while we educate ourselves. The other thing, unrelated to ag water, before we take your questions, I just wanted to say, for those that have been following the traceability rule and what that means for our farming community, yesterday or Friday, that the traceability rule was paused for 30 months for the farming community. So just wanted to give you some information so you aren't waiting until the next newsletter or something that we have to get that out to you. So that's all, Sarah.
Perfect. Thanks, Dwayne. Any questions for Dwayne or I?
Yeah, so I had a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yep.
you're good.
Okay. I had a question as far as exempt farmers. I'm part of a cooperative in Alamosa, Colorado, and we have less than $30,000 in sales. So I think we filed for an exemption. So what should we do? Like we get our pre-harvest ag water from like a lagoon and ditch irrigation or sequia irrigation. And then we wash vegetables with city water, municipal water. and hand wash with municipal water. Is there anything we should do as far as like starting, like should I start getting reports from the municipal water to approve that or start getting going on anything?
Great
So
question.
you want me
Oh,
to
go
take
ahead,
it, Sarah?
Dwayne. Or yeah, I'll go first and then Dwayne, if you want to add anything. That's a great question. So we didn't really go over exemptions. So if you aren't a very small farm, so if you're micro exempt, that means you don't have to be in compliance with the rule at all. That includes anything as far as what was covered today. However, I'd put a very big asterisk on that and say you're not required, just maybe strongly encouraged, right? So if that is something that you want to start doing, you are welcome to, but you're not required to until you reach that sales threshold of about 31,000. It's like 31,000 and change, and we'll be changing here in hopefully a few days, but until then, if you wanted to start putting these practices in place, it just means when you'd have to be compliant with it, it's not such a huge jerk. But if that's something that you want to do, you can.
Yeah, I'll reiterate kind of what Sarah said. At this point, you're not, you are micro exempt, so you are exempt from all parts of the rule. It doesn't mean you're exempt from an outbreak and the impacts that that can have. And so the practices that are in the produce safety rule were really designed on the scientific principles to help avoid and reduce your risk of an outbreak. So it's best practices that it's good to deploy. You're not required to do so. You're not required to have those records. But as your sales grow, if you start to do that now, it means you don't have to change those practices. It becomes the way you do business. It protects you and your consumers from an outbreak, which can be devastating to a company, especially a small company that can't survive an outbreak. So, good practices, not required.
So, as you're saying, like you're creating an assessment to lower risk. So, like for example, you had, let's say, like we have cows nearby. There's a cattle ranch nearby. What would we do to prevent anything happening from cattle nearby or something like that?
Yeah, go ahead, Dwayne.
Yeah, that's always the difficult one because both property owners have property rights. We're not interested in putting either one of them out of business. But there are inherent risks with cattle, livestock production, not just cattle, but livestock production that can be transferred to produce. And so, how you mitigate those risks involves, can involve what crops are growing, can involve, uh, what monitoring the water. Where does the water come from? Sometimes it requires changing water sources. Just that drainage or that irrigation ditch that runs almost through a cattle lot poses much greater risk than one that's running toward a cattle lot, for instance. So some of those things, that's part of the assessment. It walks you through those steps that you can see what your risks are and helps you figure out where you have to put emphasis and what you have to do to lower your risk.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Quiet group today. All right. Well, if no one else has any questions, I know we threw a bunch of information at you, so you may not have questions now, but maybe later. This is our contact information. Feel free to reach out to us at any time. And I will be following up with a recording of this webinar and then also the resources that I talked about. But otherwise, you are good to go. Thank you so much for coming today, and we will talk soon.
Have a good day.